The moment I understood my family no longer saw me as a person. I was standing in my daughter-in-law Leanne's kitchen, holding a casserole dish I had spent 2 days preparing, and not one person turned around to acknowledge I had arrived. Laughter poured from the living room. My son Ryan was telling some story I could hear from the hallway, his voice rising the way it always did when he wanted a crowd. My grandchildren were chasing each other around the furniture. The house smelled of pine and cinnamon, and everything that used to mean Christmas to me. And I stood there in my winter coat, still, holding that dish, waiting for someone to notice. Nobody did. I set the casserole on the counter myself, unwrapped it, and quietly hung my coat on the rack by the door. If you've ever felt invisible to the people you love most, I hope you'll stay with me today. And before I begin, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Sometimes knowing someone else is out there makes all the difference. My husband Gerald died 4 years before that Christmas. He went quickly, which is what the doctors called mercy and what I called unbearable. 38 years of marriage, and then, one Tuesday morning in November, he simply wasn't there anymore. We had met at a church potluck in Barrie, Ontario, 2 strangers reaching for the same plate of butter tarts. He had laughed and handed them to me and said he'd been trying to lose weight anyway. I married him 6 months later. Gerald was the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday without being reminded. He coached minor hockey for 12 years even after our son grew too old to play. He drove his mother to her medical appointments every single week for the last 3 years of her life without ever once complaining. When he died, our neighbors brought food for 2 weeks. People I had never properly met came to his funeral. That was the kind of man he was. After he was gone, I tried to hold things together the way you do when you've spent decades being half of something. I called Ryan every Sunday. I sent cards for every occasion. I made the drive from Barrie to Oakville 4 times a year, even when my knees were making it difficult. I told myself the distance between us was geographic, not emotional. I told myself a lot of things in those years. The truth, when it finally came, did not arrive gently. It had been building for longer than I wanted to admit. Small things, the way Leanne would change the subject when I entered a room mid-conversation. The way Ryan stopped asking how I was and started asking whether I had spoken to anyone about updating my will. The way Christmas invitations began feeling more like obligations than warmth. I made excuses for all of it. They're busy. They have the children. They're still grieving Gerald in their own way. But grief doesn't explain everything. And that Christmas, I finally stopped making excuses. I had driven down from Barrie the morning of December 23rd, 3.5 hours in light snow, because Leanne had suggested I arrive early to help with the decorating. I brought my butter tart squares, the ones from Gerald's mother's recipe, the ones Ryan had asked for every Christmas since he was 7. I brought a jar of my cranberry sauce. I brought a poinsettia, because I always brought a poinsettia, and I brought myself, which apparently was the thing nobody had actually wanted. Leanne greeted me at the door with the energy of someone who had already planned her day, and I was not part of it. "Oh, Norma, you're here," she said it, the way you'd say you're here to a package that arrived on the wrong day. "Come in. Come in. We're in the middle of getting everything organized." I had not been asked to organize anything. I had been asked to come early and help decorate. But by the time I got my coat off, the decorating was apparently finished. My grandchildren, Chloe and Finn, were lovely distractions. Chloe was 11 and had just discovered she liked to draw. She showed me her sketchbook for 20 minutes, and I meant every word when I told her she had a real gift. Finn was 8 and obsessed with hockey the way Ryan had been at that age, which made something ache pleasantly in my chest. I held on to those 20 minutes with Chloe and that conversation with Finn the way you hold on to good weather before a storm. Because the storm came at dinner. There were 14 people at that table. Gerald's old colleagues from the plant had been invited, which surprised me. 2 couples from Leanne's family I had met perhaps 3 times. Ryan's university friend, Adrian, and his wife. Everyone had a seat. The table had been extended into the dining room. Chairs crowded close together, and there was a warmth to the whole arrangement that felt festive and full, except there was no place set for me. I walked around the table twice before I accepted what I was seeing. My usual seat, the one beside where Ryan always sat. The one I had occupied at every Christmas dinner in that house for 11 years, had been given to Leanne's mother, Beverly. Nobody had mentioned this to me. Nobody had offered an alternative. Leanne eventually appeared from the kitchen, glanced at me standing there with nowhere to go, and said, "Oh, Norma, I meant to tell you. We've set you up at the island." The island. The kitchen island. She had placed a bar stool at the granite kitchen island with a plate and a cloth napkin. Close enough to hear the conversation in the dining room if you strained. Far enough away that you understood you were not part of it. I sat there and ate Christmas dinner on a bar stool while everyone else laughed at a proper table 15 feet away. I smiled when someone looked over. I refilled my own water glass twice. I watched Leanne carry the butter tart squares to the dining room without once mentioning who made them. Halfway through dinner, I needed a moment. I excused myself, though no one was paying enough attention to require it, and walked down the hall toward the bathroom. Ryan and Leanne's home office was adjacent, and the door was slightly ajar. I had no intention of listening, but I heard my name. It was Ryan's voice first. "Mom's not going to like it." Then, "Adrian, does she have to like it?" "She just has to agree." Then Leanne, lower, more careful. "We have to do this proper." The solicitor was clear. "She needs to sign while she still has capacity." I stopped breathing. While she still has capacity. I was 67 years old. I had driven myself from Barrie that morning in the snow. I did my own taxes. I read 3 novels a month, and my daughter-in-law was discussing whether I possessed the mental capacity to sign a legal document. Leanne continued. "Ryan, you have to talk to her after the holidays. Don't wait." Adrian said something I couldn't quite hear. Then Ryan, I know. The cottage needs to go first." The cottage. Gerald and I had owned a cottage on Lake Simcoe for 22 years. It was the place where we had spent every long weekend from May to October, where Ryan had learned to fish, where I still went alone in the summers with a kettle and a library book and the specific kind of peace that only comes from water and silence. That cottage was mine now, entirely mine, and apparently it was already being discussed in terms of a timeline. I walked back to my bar stool and finished my dinner. When dessert was served, I sat quietly and watched. The butter tart squares came around. Beverly had 2 and complimented the pastry. No one mentioned my name. No one asked if I would like more tea. At one point, Leanne laughed at something Adrian said, and I looked at my son across the room, and he did not look back at me once. I made my decision somewhere around 9 o'clock. I waited until the children had been put to bed, and the guests were gathered in the living room. I retrieved my coat from the rack. I collected the empty casserole dish from the counter where it had been rinsed and left to dry without acknowledgement. I picked up my purse. I walked to the front door. Not one person looked up. I stepped outside into the December cold. The street was quiet. Someone down the block had lights strung along their fence that blinked blue and white, cheerful and indifferent. I stood on the porch for a long moment and looked at the house. Through the window, I could see the warm gold of the living room, the Christmas tree, the shapes of people who had once been my family. Then I walked to my car and drove away. I did not take the highway home to Barrie. I drove instead to a motel just outside Burlington, a clean and quiet place I had once stayed with Gerald when we were caught in a snowstorm during a trip south. I booked a room and sat on the edge of the bed and called no one. After 40 minutes, my phone lit up. Ryan. I stared at his name on the screen. Then the call ended and a text appeared. "Mom, where are you?" Then another, "Are you driving?" Then, 20 minutes later, "Call me when you get home." Get home. Not "Are you all right?" Not "We're sorry." Not "We should have said something." Get home so they could tick me off the list. I set the phone face down and thought about Gerald. There was a barrister in Barrie named Patricia Holt who had handled Gerald's estate. She had been patient and thorough and kind throughout that entire process, and at the end of it she had said to me, "Norma, if anything ever troubles you regarding these matters, you call me first, day or night." I had written her number on the inside cover of the address book I keep in my purse, the old-fashioned paper one, because Gerald always said you shouldn't trust important things only to your phone. I opened the address book. I did not call her that night, but I held the number in my hand for a long time. In the morning I called. Patricia Holt answered on the 3rd ring, which surprised me given it was the 24th of December. She heard the brief version of what had happened, what I had overheard, the kitchen island, the word capacity, the cottage. There was a silence on her end that felt careful rather than uncertain. Then she said, "Norma, I think you should come in as soon as the holidays are over, and in the meantime I want you to do something for me." "What's that?" "Do not sign anything." I had not planned to, but the seriousness with which she said it made my stomach tighten. I told her I wouldn't. Then I drove back to Barry through Christmas Eve morning with the radio off and the heater on, and the particular clarity that comes when you realize you have been sleepwalking through something important for a very long time. My phone continued through the day. Ryan 3 times, Leanne once. A group text from Ryan saying he hoped I had made it home safely. I replied to that one only. Home safe. Merry Christmas. Then I made myself tea, fed the cat, and sat by my kitchen window watching snow settle on the backyard I had tended for 30 years. Gerald had planted a crabapple tree back there when Norma was born. He had said every grandchild should have a tree to watch grow. The tree was 11 feet tall now. I looked at it for a long time. 3 days after Christmas, I sat across from Patricia Holt in her office on Dunlop Street. She was perhaps 60 herself, neat and precise, with the manner of someone who had heard many difficult stories and had learned not to perform surprise. She had a folder open in front of her, and she asked me to walk her through everything I had heard, beginning to end. When I finished, she didn't say what I expected. She didn't reassure me that I had probably misunderstood or that families sometimes things out of stress. She said, "There is a document currently in circulation related to a property transfer, Norma, and your signature is on it." I stared at her. "From a meeting in October," she continued, "a preliminary authorization form connected to what appears to be a cottage transfer." I did not attend any meeting in October. She looked at me steadily. "I know." The room became very quiet. I heard the radiator tick. I heard someone in the outer office answer a phone. I heard my own breath coming slowly and carefully, the way you breathe when you're trying not to panic. I had not signed that document. I was certain of it the way you are certain of your own name. My signature was recognizable to me, the particular angle of the N, the way I drew the last A of Norma back through itself, a habit from a penmanship teacher in grade 4, who had called it her signature trademark. Whatever was on that form, it was not mine. Patricia placed the copy on the desk between us. I looked at it without touching it. "Close," I said. "But not mine." She nodded. "That's what I needed to hear you say." She explained what she had pieced together. Gerald, in the years before his illness advanced, had quietly restructured several things. He had been thorough about it in the way he was thorough about everything, without announcing it, without drama, simply doing what needed to be done. The cottage was held in a trust with specific protective provisions. Any transfer required not only my signature but a secondary legal review and a mandatory 28-day reflection period. Whoever had prepared that preliminary authorization had either not known this or had been hoping it would not come up. Patricia opened a second folder. She said Gerald had left something with her, not at the time of his death. Earlier, several years before when he was first diagnosed and was being careful, she placed an envelope on the desk. I recognized his handwriting immediately. "For Norma, if needed." That was all it said on the front. 4 words. I sat with my hands in my lap for a moment before I opened it. His letter was 3 pages, handwritten, the paper slightly heavier than usual because Gerald always good paper for things that mattered. He had known or suspected. Not everything, but enough. He wrote about noticing certain questions from Ryan over the years, a pattern he couldn't quite name but couldn't quite dismiss. He wrote about Adrian, who had been Ryan's business partner in a venture that had not gone well, a fact I was dimly aware of but had not connected to anything until that moment. He wrote about the cottage. "I want you to keep the cottage, Norma. Not because it's valuable, though it is. Because you are happy there in a way you are nowhere else. I have tried to make sure no one can take it from you without your full and willing consent. Trust Patricia. She knows everything." I pressed my fingers against my eyes for a moment. Then I kept reading. "You have spent 30 years making things easier for everyone around you. Please spend whatever time remains making things easier for yourself. You are allowed to do that. You always were. I should have said that more. The last line nearly undid me. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and held it in my lap, while Patricia waited quietly. She had a box of tissues on the corner of her desk. She did not push it toward me. She simply gave me the time. Eventually, I asked what needed to happen next. Patricia was the kind of person who prepared plans. Over the following days, while Ryan continued sending careful texts asking when I was coming to visit, and whether I had spoken to anyone about the cottage since Gerald's estate had settled, Patricia and I reviewed everything. Accounts, authorizations, records of who had access to what and since when. What we found was not a master criminal operation. It was something in some ways more disappointing. It was ordinary weakness, financial pressure, a business that had not recovered, debt that had been accumulated quietly and was now pressing hard. Adrian, who I had sat across from at Christmas dinner, had been Ryan's partner in a construction venture that had lost a significant amount of money. The timeline of the losses corresponded almost exactly with the timeline of Ryan's increased interest in the cottage. I was not an inheritance. I was a solution. Patricia also found that Leanne had been more central to the planning than I had understood from that hallway conversation. She had the organizational instinct Ryan lacked, the ability to think in steps. The meeting in October, the preliminary form, the choice of language around capacity. These had not been Ryan's ideas alone. A week into January, my granddaughter Chloe called me. She was the one who called me directly, not through her parents, just her small, determined voice on my phone. On a Wednesday evening, asking if I was okay because she had heard arguing at home. I told her I was fine and that I loved her and that she should not worry. She said she had been drawing a picture of the cottage to show me. I told her I would very much like to see it. Before we hung up, she said, "Grandma, I heard Dad say the plan isn't working." I wasn't trying to listen. "I know, sweetheart, I know." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The crabapple tree was just visible through the window in the dark, the shape of it against the snow. I thought about Gerald planting it. I thought about Ryan as a little boy helping him dig the hole. I thought about the version of our family I had believed in for so long, and what it actually costs to finally let it go. It costs everything. And then, gradually it costs less. By February, Patricia and I were ready to meet with Ryan and Leanne. We set it for a Saturday morning at Patricia's office, which was neutral in the way that kitchen tables never are. I arrived first. I sat in a chair by the window and watched snow fall on Dunlop Street and breathed slowly and thought about Gerald telling me, "Everything's going to be fine," and tried to believe it. They arrived together. Ryan looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. Leanne looked composed in the deliberate way of someone who had prepared what she intended to say. They both stopped slightly when they saw Patricia's expression. And mine. There was no version of what followed that felt like a victory. I want to be clear about that. When you sit across from your own son and watch him slowly understand that you know what he was planning, there is no satisfaction in it. There is only grief for what should have been and wasn't. Patricia laid out the documents, the unauthorized preliminary authorization, the timeline of discussions regarding the cottage, the financial records she had obtained through legitimate channels, the evidence of Adrian's involvement. She was thorough without being cruel. She was precise without being theatrical. She was, in that moment, exactly what Gerald had known she would be. Ryan could not look at me for most of it. Leanne was the first to speak in their own defense. She said they had been worried. She said the cottage was sitting empty most of the year. She said they had been trying to think practically. She used the word practical 3 times in 4 sentences, and each time it landed the same way. I waited until she was finished. Then I said, "Was I at any of those practical conversations?" She looked at the table. "Was I consulted about any of this? Nothing. Was I asked what I wanted?" Ryan finally looked up. "Mom." His voice broke on the single syllable. I wasn't going to let Adrian take everything. I had to do something. I looked at my son. The man who had once cried at the hockey rink when he lost a playoff game, and who I had held in the parking lot for 20 minutes after. The little boy who had helped his father plant a tree. "You could have talked to me," I said. "I know." That was all. Just I know. And in it was the whole truth of what had happened between us. Not wickedness, not a criminal mind. Desperation and poor choices, and a wife who had planned where he had only panicked. And the slow erosion of a relationship that had once been something real, eaten away by distance and money, and the quiet assumption that elderly mothers were manageable. Leanne was more difficult to forgive, and I was honest with myself about that. Her involvement had been more deliberate, the meetings more organized, the language around capacity more calculated. But I was also honest about the fact that forgiveness was not the same thing as reconciliation, and reconciliation was not the same thing as trust, and trust was something that would take a very long time to address, if ever. I placed my own folder on the table. Patricia had helped me prepare it over the preceding weeks. It contained several documents, an updated trust with reinforced provisions, a revised power of attorney naming Patricia as my attorney for personal care, not Ryan, a letter of wishes regarding the cottage that made my intentions unambiguous, and one additional document they had not expected. Ryan frowned at it. "What's this?" "A gift," I said to Chloe. Leanne's face changed. I had established a small education fund in Chloe's name. Not enormous, but meaningful. Because Chloe had called me from her bedroom on a Wednesday night to ask if I was all right. Because Chloe showed me her sketchbook. Because Chloe had said, "I wasn't trying to listen. The apology of a child who still believed honesty was something you offered freely without calculating the cost." I was not punishing Ryan by doing this. I was recognizing character. There is a difference. Finn's fund would come when he was older, once I understood him better. That much I said aloud. I wanted Ryan to hear it. Some things can still be earned. The meeting ended the way difficult true things tend to end. Not dramatically, not cleanly. Ryan hugged me in the parking lot afterward, and I let him. And it was not a comfortable hug, but it was real. Leanne said she was sorry, and I said I heard her, and that was as far as either of us could get that day. Adrian I did not speak to. There are limits to the grace any person can extend in a single February morning. I drove back to Barry along the highway, with the sun low and bright on the snow-covered fields. I thought about the letter in my purse. I thought about Gerald writing it at the kitchen table of the cottage, probably on a Sunday morning, probably with his second cup of coffee, being careful with the pen the way he was careful with things he meant to last. I thought about what he had written. "You are allowed to make things easier for yourself. You always were." It took me 67 years and a bar stool at Christmas dinner, and a forged signature on a cottage transfer to fully believe that sentence. I believe it now. In April, I went to the cottage for the first time that year. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, just me and a bag of groceries and a library book, and the spare key Gerald had kept on a hook by the back door. The lake was still cold, the ice barely gone from the sheltered parts near the shore. I built a fire in the wood stove and made tea, and sat in the chair by the window that has the best view of the water. I had not been there since Gerald died. I had been afraid to go alone, afraid of what the silence would be without him in it. What I found instead was that the silence remembered him. His fishing rods were still in the shed. His coffee mug was still on the second shelf. The tree he had planted along the south side of the property, a maple, had put out its first leaves. I sat by that window for a long time, and I cried the way you cry when something has finally ended, and something else has finally begun. A new neighbor, 2 cottages down, a woman my age named Frances, knocked on my door that evening to introduce herself. She had lost her husband the previous autumn. She brought a bottle of wine and said she hoped I didn't mind. We sat on the porch in our coats until nearly 10 o'clock, talking about everything and nothing, the lake, our gardens, where we had grown up, what it was like to do things alone that you had always done with someone else. She came back the following morning with coffee and said she had enjoyed herself and hoped I had too. I had. I went back to the cottage 6 more times that year. Frances was there for 3 of them. 2 other women from the small lake community began appearing at the screen door on weekend mornings. A retired teacher from Sudbury named Gwen, who had a canoe and strong opinions about fiction. A widow from Penetanguishene named Carol, who gardened with serious ambition and brought fresh tomatoes in August. These were not the family I had expected to have at this point in my life. They were something I had not known to expect, which perhaps made them more valuable. Ryan and I speak now. Not every Sunday, but often enough. Leanne and I are polite in the way of people who understand each other, clearly, which is its own kind of honesty. Chloe sends me photographs of her drawings sometimes, through her own phone, just for me. Last month, she sent one of the cottage from memory, the porch, the water, the maple tree in autumn color. I printed it and put it on the refrigerator. There is a lesson in all of this that I have been a long time learning. Loving your family is not the same as surrendering your judgment to them. Being a good mother is not the same as being a person who asks nothing and accepts everything and sits quietly on a bar stool at Christmas dinner and tells herself that this is fine. This is love. This is what family looks like. I know now what family looks like. It looks like Frances bringing coffee on a Saturday morning. It looks like Chloe drawing the cottage from memory because it matters to her. It looks like Patricia Holt picking up the phone on Christmas Eve morning and saying, "Norma, come in as soon as you can." It looks like Gerald's letter in my purse, still there, the paper soft now from being folded and unfolded many times. If you have ever sat at a table where you were made to feel like an afterthought, I want you to hear this. Your presence is not an obligation for others to manage. Your future is not a problem for other people to solve. Your name on a document should belong to your hand and your choice and no one else's. You spent decades building something. You are allowed to decide what happens to it. And if the table you've always sat at no longer has room for you, then perhaps it is finally time to build your own, and be very deliberate about who you invite to sit around it.